All right, why don't we get started? So first of all, welcome, and thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. I hope that many of you on the line today enjoyed part one of the webinar, which was presented last Tuesday. For those of you who missed it and are interested, we will post a recording online soon. The informal comments we received last week were very positive, and we'll circulate a survey following today's webinar with a few short questions asking for your feedback on the webinar as a whole. We would very much appreciate if you could take a few moments to complete that survey, since we'll be going through all the responses in detail to help us plan a similar event next year. For those who couldn't join us last week, my name is Elena Hofstein, and I am hosting and moderating this two-part program. Like last week, today's webinar will run from 9 a.m. to 10:45. I'm going to spend a few minutes this morning recapping the purpose of the program and introducing the specific topics which we're going to cover today. In my role as a lawyer at Fogler-Rubinoff, my practice focuses on trust and estate litigation and dispute resolution. My department comprises estate planning lawyers, tax lawyers, and litigators who regularly deal with business succession planning, and we often help clients who are working through the many challenges involved in passing down a business and planning the distribution of their own wealth, and in my case, with clients who are trying to resolve a dispute over that business or the administration of an estate or a trust. Estate and business succession planning often involves an element of philanthropy, which is popular for many reasons, including the desire to improve one's own community, to leave a legacy for future generations, to take advantage of financial benefits, which make charitable giving effective for both donors and recipients. As such, the partnership between my firm, Fogler-Rubinoff, and UJA was a natural one. And this program is designed to raise awareness of some of those critical issues in succession planning and highlight some of the benefits of incorporating philanthropy into your plans and into the fabric of your family. Time obviously doesn't allow for us to cover all the topics we had hoped or to cover them in as much depth as we would like, but I'm confident that you'll find this program useful in getting you thinking about the issues and giving you questions to discuss with your own professional advisors. Before I move on to tell you about today's program, I'd like to thank our signature sponsor, Scotiabank, and the webinar sponsor, wealthinsurance.com, for their ongoing support. We have another great program today. First, you'll hear from Amy Dupree, a life transitions coach, and Elena Hofstein, an experienced estate planning lawyer, about how to plan for the surviving spouse who's not the primary income earner. You'll then hear from Sarah Lefton, Senior VP and Campaign Director at UJA, who's going to give you a snapshot of the impact of your charitable dollars in the community and the importance of engaging the next generation. Saul Plenner is then going to talk about how to structure a philanthropic gift and how a donor-advised fund can get your family involved in a hands-on way in the act of directing charitable dollars. And finally, you'll hear from Jessica Davis and Eli Scheichet about how to use insurance strategically to protect your business and your family. Each of today's speakers have tremendously impressive biographies. I don't just say that because they agreed to speak at this webinar, but because they were each chosen to speak specifically because of their expertise in these areas. You can find their biographies by clicking on their photos in the email invitation which you used to register for this event. And I'm grateful for each of them for giving their time to speak to us today. We've provided time for questions and answers immediately following most of the speakers. If you'd like to ask a question, you'll find a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. That button will open a dialog box where you can type your questions, and I will put as many of your questions as time allows to the speakers. So with that, let me turn to our first panel. I'll ask our speakers to open to activate their videos and unmute their lines now. Amy Dupree is a life transitions expert and is recognized internationally as an authority on issues relating to retirement and estate planning and family dynamics. She has been a guest on radio and TV shows and recorded podcasts on these and related issues. She has also been chosen as one of Canada's top businesswomen by Women's Post Media. Elena Hofstein is a lawyer with Miller Thomson here in Toronto. She's recognized in many, many peer-reviewed rankings in Canada and internationally as one of the top estate planning lawyers and an expert in charity and not-for-profit law. She's won many coveted awards and is a lifelong student, and she recently completed her FEA designation, which is the Family Enterprise Advisor designation, and relates directly to the issues which we're talking about today. Perhaps her greatest achievement is having given birth to and raised the host of this webinar series, me. Since this is about family businesses, I thought it was only fitting that I asked my mother to be one of the speakers. So with that, Mother, Amy, I leave it to you.
Well, thank you, Eric. Yes, I do recognize my greatest achievements, one of whom is here. So thank you, and hi, everybody. Great to not see you, unfortunately, and hopefully next year we'll be able to do this in person. Eric, do you want to go to PowerPoint number 3? I'm technologically challenged, so Eric is going to monitor my my PowerPoint presentation. When Eric asked me to speak about this topic of planning for the non-income earning spouse, there are a lot of ideas that came to mind, and there are a lot of issues when planning for the non-income earning spouse. And those issues are compounded when you have a complex situation like a blended family, which so many of our clients are in blended family situations, or when you have complex assets like a family business, as Eric mentioned. Given the time constraints, I'm not going to be able to cover any of these topics in great detail, but what I thought I would give you when I thought about how to organize this was a potpourri of the issues I consider when I'm talking to families, and in particular to spouses or patriarch or matriarch of the family, and how to deal with a lot of these issues. My presentation goes into more detail on these topics if you have an interest in pursuing them, and I provide some notes to assist. So the agenda that I'm proposing is, keeping the assets in the family, dealing with some of the matters that should be considered when you are talking about these assets. Use of trusts. Trusts are one of my favorite topics. So of course I couldn't speak without having some discussion about the use of trusts and some of the challenges that the trusts that we face with trusts. And lastly, talking about joint assets. And then if I have time at the end, some suggestions for consideration. If not, I'll leave you the PowerPoints to review. So Eric, PowerPoint 5. So what are the common objectives when we when we're talking about the non-income earning spouse and providing for that non-income earning spouse? And these are fairly typical. First of all, obviously providing for that spouse, whether it's a first spouse or a spouse of a second or third marriage, the issues are fairly similar. The reduction, deferral, or elimination of income tax is always a popular topic for discussion, and avoiding probate tax in provinces such as Ontario is always obviously a very important matter. And then preserving assets for the next generation. Avoiding strife is something we should be looking at and often do, but that one is about the most challenging of the objectives that we have to face. We try to reduce tensions if possible, and if we can't reduce tensions, what are things that could be discussed? Amy's going to talk about that in her talk as well. What are the factors to consider? Eric, next PowerPoint. We have tax issues with respect to assets such as registered assets and who best to leave them to. Obviously, given the tax regime that we're under, assets such as RSPs or RIFs are best left directly to a surviving spouse. But shares of a family business, again, leaving them in some fashion to a surviving spouse is often a good tax technique. There are issues relating to that, which I'll deal with in a minute. Life insurance, I know you're going to be talking about life insurance later on, but it's very often a topic for discussion. I don't sell life insurance, but clearly it's a very important element in estate planning, and particularly when you've got complex assets that are not easily liquidatable. That is commonly a good solution to consider. And then you've got other problem assets such as the matrimonial home and the cottage property, and if you have to consider how to leave it, that's another problem that needs to be considered. Next PowerPoint, Eric. The next question that has to be asked is, how do you leave an asset? Do you leave it outright or in trust? If there are concerns about remarriage or trying to ensure that assets go to the next generation or asset protection concerns, then clearly leaving assets outright is not the perfect solution, and a trust has to be considered. Next PowerPoint, Eric. And some of the issues that we need to talk about relate to the assets that are in question. Shares of a family business, and this is a topic of this conference, is often an important element of a family's wealth. And so that is something that is intended to provide for the next generation, but also a source of income for the surviving spouse. In that regard, it's important to have consideration of constraints on whether that type of an asset can be transferred to a spouse and the manner in which it can be transferred. There's also conflicts of interest that arise because very often there are different roles that are taken by family members, not just the surviving spouse, but the children. How involved are they in the business? Who are the directors? Who are the residuary beneficiaries? In philanthropy is going to be discussed, but philanthropy very often comes into the mix, and there are tax and other issues that arise as to leaving assets following death. It's become much more complicated in that regard. Tax considerations with respect to leaving RSPs. If you're going to leave things to a surviving spouse, leaving an RSP is one very important element to consider because of the fact that tax is reduced if that asset is left to a surviving spouse. Life insurance is tax-free, so that's something that can be considered as to whether to leave it to surviving spouse outright or in trust, or to the next generation. In all of these discussions, it's important to have regard to inter vivos arrangements or agreements that have been entered into, such as marriage contracts, shareholder agreements. How are assets owned? Are they held jointly? Are they held as tenants in common? Eric, please go back. You're ahead of me. I was in PowerPoint 8. Thank you. Another asset that creates a lot of issues is a home, matrimonial home, or vacation properties. That is a whole separate topic in and of itself. And I just mention it because when you're dealing with a cottage property or a matrimonial home, there's a lot of emotion around that. And you really need to walk yourself through scenarios with your clients when you're deciding how to deal with those assets. Next PowerPoint. So the challenges that we have in dealing with all these issues are, financial issues, clearly, competing interests of the various parties and their involvement with the asset, and emotional issues. I'm going to leave the emotional issues to Amy, but I'll try to deal with some of the others. Okay, so PowerPoint 11. So marriage contracts or cohabitation agreements, it is really important to ask the question, have you entered into a marriage contract, whether it's a first marriage or a subsequent marriage, because very often those contracts have obligations that the parties to the contract have committed to, especially with the non-income earning spouse. And so you need to ensure that the contract doesn't conflict with the overall estate plan that you are discussing with your client, and make sure that whatever obligations the client has undertaken or agreed to are fulfilled in providing for the non-income earning spouse. It's also important when we go to talk about trusts, as we're going to do in a minute, whether there are any family law act rights that the spouse may invoke if they're not happy with the arrangement where there's a trust set up for the surviving spouse. And I'll talk about that more in a minute. Next PowerPoint. And another very important agreement that should be reviewed is a shareholder agreement. If you're dealing with shares of a family business, then and you're talking to your clients about leaving say shares and how to leave shares and whether you can leave them in trust to the surviving spouse. If a shareholder agreement says that is not a permitted transferee, that a spouse is not a permitted transferee, you need to know that in talking about options with your clients. So again, you need to review shareholder agreements to see what the restrictions might be on the issuance and transfer of shares. In addition to that, even if permitted transferees include transfers to a spousal trust for the benefit of the surviving spouse, there may be some restrictions on whether that the terms of the trust can provide only for income or for the ability to encroach on capital, may also identify who can or cannot act as a trustee. So again, these types of agreements are very important to consider when you're addressing how to plan for the non-income earning spouse. Eric, PowerPoint 14. So clearly, trusts are an important element of the planning process for a surviving spouse. And, you know, what some of the competing interests are, you want to provide for a surviving spouse, but you also want to preserve assets for the next generation. And in particular, in the remarriage situation, trusts are a common tool to use for dealing with those competing interests. It's also effective from an income tax perspective because there is a possibility to defer the tax until the death of the second spouse, and maybe also provide for life insurance to be available at the time when the tax does arise. So these are all planning techniques that should be considered in these scenarios of providing for trusts. Eric, next PowerPoint. So some of the challenges, and there are many, so I had many to choose from, but for example, in the situation of a blended marriage, when you've got a new spouse and the biological children are close in age to the new spouse, that is a recipe for disaster and really has to be considered very carefully. What if the new spouse and the biological children don't get along? Very often, regrettably, very often the case. And even if they do get along, and I think this is something Eric alluded to when he was making his comments last week about trustees, what if everyone gets along while the founder of the business is alive, but you can just see how things can disintegrate when that unifying force has died. And so you can't take anything for granted, even current situations. And even when people say we get along famously, we're the exception to the rule, everyone has to take that comment with a grain of salt. Some of the other factors to be considered in using a spousal trust is, and we all know how to draft spousal trusts. We all know that the spousal trust needs to provide for income to the surviving spouse, doesn't need to provide for capital, but needs to provide for income to the surviving spouse for his or her lifetime. But what does that mean? Those are words on a piece of paper. When you have shares of a business, there has to be some consideration given to how you populate that word. How do you ensure that the surviving spouse is going to get income from the family business to provide for his or her lifestyle? And very often it's an important factor to consider, to put some direction into the wills or into the inter vivos trust to state what is required in terms of an income level, and you know, do more than just give total discretion to the trustees or hope that the directors of the company will do the right thing, because that doesn't always happen. There's also considerations when there's a lack of liquidity and you can't get yourself out of a situation where everyone's locked into the family business and can't extricate themselves, and it creates a recipe for disaster. I've had a situation, which I'll talk about in a minute, but in any event, there's also issues, again, as I mentioned earlier, about problem assets. The principal residence is one potential problem assets, but the cottage property is definitely a challenging one. There's a lot of emotional overlay on the use of a cottage property that needs to be considered when talking about sharing or providing for a surviving spouse to have the ability to enjoy that cottage property, and then children either of the same marriage or of a previous marriage who are looking at enjoying that same cottage property. COVID has simply increased that problem because everyone's trying to get out of the city, and if only one person has the right to enjoy the cottage, you can see how that could lead to problems. Eric, next PowerPoint 16. So again, these are some of the issues that I've already mentioned about how to provide for a spouse. I find that having separate classes of shares or providing separately for a spouse is really important to try to reduce or avoid friction, and also providing guidance for the directors and the trustees, trying to reduce that strife or friction. It doesn't always work, but it's something to be considered. And don't forget that if you don't have a marriage contract that provides for what's to happen in the death scenario, it could be that all the best laid plans are overturned when the surviving spouse says, you know, I don't care that I have a life interest in 100% of the estate. I'd rather have total ownership and separate myself from the family by taking whatever my Family Law Act allows me to take. Eric is telling me I better hurry up and stop talking, but I did want to mention one thing in passing, that I had a situation a long time ago where a surviving spouse wasn't happy about the fact that she wasn't getting any income from her spousal trust. And it was a little troubling when the lawyer who was trying to deal with the strife said, oh, well, you know, you were never intended to get any income. The spousal trust was just a parking lot to defer the tax. She didn't like the fact that she was being considered a parking lot, and the inevitable happened, and she took her Family Law Act election. So these are very live, very real issues. I will only mention inter vivos trust to say that though inter vivos trusts have the same issues and the same concerns as I've just mentioned with respect to testamentary trusts. Moving on to joint assets, number 19. I'm almost there. So holding assets jointly is estate planning done in advance, because the ownership of a joint asset means that it goes by survivorship to the surviving person, whether it's a surviving spouse or to children. So you can't deal with it in your will. So one of the things you need to look at is how are assets held. If they're held jointly, the planning's already been done, unless you change that joint ownership. So owning assets jointly is one way to get around probate tax to provide for a surviving spouse, but it could also lead to issues if in fact it was never intended that the surviving spouse own the asset outright. With respect to children, next PowerPoint, Eric. With respect to children, be careful about putting joint assets jointly with the names of children, because it does lead to tax issues, and also exposes those assets to the claims of creditors and spouses of the child, and also some presumptions of resulting trust that can be problematic. And I refer you to the very recent case of Kolmusky, which just came out, which deals with resulting trust argument with respect to Rsps. So something interesting for you to consider, that it's not just jointly owned assets, but now the presumption of resulting trust, the PICOR decision, has been expanded to deal with Rsps. Don't know if that's going to last, but that is currently the state of the law. Then moving to PowerPoint 21. So again, because I've run out of time, I just point to you on the last few overheads some suggestions about providing for blended families, things to think about when you are planning for these people. And I must say that the most important consideration, and I'm sure that Amy's going to talk about this more, is communication. Very often I have clients who will not talk to their children, will not talk to their spouses, and it's just not helpful if they refuse to do that. Having communication with the family, letting the family know what to expect, is very often a friction reducer. Doesn't always work. I've had a situation where we opened the the envelope and shared all the information with the spouse and the children, and still led to litigation. But that's the unusual situation, and more often than not, early communication and open communication does help resolve tension. So thank you, everyone, and I'm going to turn it over to Amy.
That was a perfect lead-in. Thank you. I loved it, Elena, and thank you for that last slide, particularly in talking about communication, because you couldn't be more right about that. I think, I have the great pleasure of often getting to speak on panels with lawyers or financial advisors, and the things that I do are what we call the soft stuff. But you did such a beautiful job talking about all the legal issues and the documents and what people need to consider. And now I get to come in and say, so how can you really proactively support the spouse? And then also in the aftermath, what can we do? So I'm going to talk about it from both standpoints. But Ellen, I really could just say what you said, communication, and that could be the whole 20 minutes that I talk about here. And I am going to do that to some extent. And a lot of what I think that I get to talk about, I try to simplify for people in how do you deal with these complex family situations? How do you have these conversations in the reality of what we know are our families? So I'm going to share with you today a couple of things that they're actually quite simple, but they're hard to implement. So I'm going to just share my screen for a second here. And I have like 3 PowerPoints, and they're incredibly simple, but you'll see that they do have an impact when we start talking about, see if I can pull this up here. Hold on one second. Okay, there we go. So this is, it doesn't get much more simple than this, but this is the 1, 2, 3 for me. But if people would do this, and I bet Elena will agree with me on this, if they would simply do these 3 T's about think, talk, take action. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So what do you have to think about? What we want to get people thinking about ahead of time are the emotional and family ramifications of all those things that Elena just talked about, the what. And so what I try to get people thinking about are, let's look at your particular family situation and let's think about both, and I try to get spouses to do this individually and together. What are your unique family situations? What are likely to be the family ramifications and the ramifications emotionally for the surviving spouse? Now, you may think that's obvious that people would do that. Honestly, I think it's for a number of reasons that people don't do this. I think part of it is we tend to want to avoid what we think will be conflict. And what I say to people is, you can delay conflict, you rarely can avoid it. And actually what usually happens in families when you delay conversations is the conflict grows over time. And when the surviving spouse is left to deal with this in the aftermath, it's almost always worse than if it had been dealt with up front. So there is the, I'll think about it tomorrow because I don't want to deal with the conflict issue that keeps people from thinking about it. And then I think there's a practicality in how we're all living our lives in very busy ways, that it's hard to be dealing with what's happening today in our lives and at the same time be projecting into the future about what are our family issues going to be, in the aftermath of a surviving spouse, and what's that going to look like. This is worth doing. It's worth taking the time to really think about these ramifications, recognizing you can't avoid conflict, you can only delay it. And if you do delay it, it's likely that you're leaving someone else to pick up the pieces in the aftermath of your death. And so I often get people engaged in conversation by thinking about legacy, and not just financial legacy, because we've sort of shrunk legacy often to be that, but really about legacy from the standpoint of our legacy of leaving behind the essence of who we are, leaving behind our stories, our values, the impact that we want to have on the world. That's our legacy. And so when I ask people to think through the lens of legacy, it shifts how they then approach their family situations. Okay, the second part of there is obviously talking. So when we say talk, and I want you to know I work with real life families. I have a real life family. I depending on your age and listening to this call, I used to be able to joke and talk about that. I didn't grow up in the Brady Bunch, and most people didn't. Today, that reference is losing its cultural implications for younger people. But the idea that everybody just gets along, we know is not true. So what I try to get families to do is to think about, let's be realistic about your family. What's your family like? Well, let's talk about who are the players in this. And I say that we need to talk about to three different groups when we're talking about issues, both current and in the future. We need to talk to people who are going to be involved in whatever's going to happen. So it could be, Elena talked about the cottage. That's one of my favorite issues to talk about because there's so much around the cottage. So who might be involved in the cottage after the death of one of the spouses, and trying to figure out who's going to be using the cottage? Who's going to be impacted? So there's involved, there's impacted, and then there's a very key category that we can't leave out, and that's the disruptors. So I always ask people to make a list of who's involved, who's impacted, and who's likely to disrupt. And, you know, in our families, we actually know who's likely to be a disruptor. I had the pleasure and honor of working with a family on the West Coast around some issues, and there were 4 siblings and a surviving spouse and a family business, and everybody knew that one of the daughters was absolutely the disruptor. And so we brought that into the planning and the conversation because you can't ignore that. That's what's going to blow things up in the long run. Okay, so I'm also going to talk to you about how to have these conversations. So let me move this ahead, but we're going to come back to the take action in a second. So I talk about these conversations as essential conversations, and essential conversations are talking to the most important people about the most important things in our lives. And when we look at a process for families doing that, one of the things we have to look at is who actually needs to be involved in the conversation. And we just said the different groups involved, impacted, and disruptor. But you know, one of the things to keep in mind is you don't have to have your entire family sitting together having these conversations. In many, if I might say most families, that's not realistic. I can tell you it would not have been realistic in my family for all of us to sit in the same room and necessarily have these conversations. But if you're generation 1 and you're looking ahead and thinking proactively about what you're going to do, you do need to think about, who do you start with? Who's the first person you have the conversation with if it's not everyone? And then how do you move through having conversations, and ultimately can you bring people together? And Elena talked about the whole issue of blended families. It obviously makes this more complex, but not having the conversations is one of the biggest mistakes. Okay, so you figured out, here's who we're going to start with. Now what we're going to do is we're going to focus the conversation. What I mean by that is, what I know happens when we end up having family conversations, because we're by nature, we don't typically sit and have these what feel like difficult conversations with our families very often. We have to focus and say, this is what I'd like to talk with you about. Now, other things are going to come up. I ask people to write it down, you know, put it in a parking lot. We'll set another time to talk about it. That keeps things from getting out of hand. Then there's the opportunity to share information, giving people the chance to react, respond, ask questions. If there's a to-do list that comes out of that, great. There's not always a to-do list, but there may be follow-up. And then the last step, the 5th step for this is key, and that's scheduling the follow-up conversation. And the reason this is so important is because people process at different speeds when we're having conversation. So, you know, if you're generation 1 and you're having conversations with your adult kids, you may have had time to think this through. You sit down with one of your or numerous of your kids, you start having these conversations. It may be the first time they're thinking it through. They walk away, they start thinking about it, and they realize, wait a minute, I'm not sure I agree with this, or I'm not sure I understand this. So by scheduling the next conversation while you're having the first, what it prevents is then the opportunity to say, okay, we got through that. Let's never talk about that again. So even if that come back to have the next conversation is just to say, hey, everybody still okay? We still on the same page? Anything else we need to discuss? This works very, very well. It's a very simple process for having an essential conversation. It's not something that, you know, is rigid. It just gives a little bit of structure and a little bit of flow. So after this, you're going to get a handout that looks like this, that takes you through a little bit more information on how do you have an essential conversation. Okay, so going back to here, what's the take action part? Well, ahead of time, proactively, one of the things that you can look at is making sure that your spouse, and if we think about the non-income earning spouse, have they met all the advisors? That's a key question. Oftentimes, after someone dies, the surviving spouse hasn't even had the opportunity to meet advisors ahead of time. Is there education that they need ahead of time? These are questions, that's part of the think about, and that's part of the take action. So that's what a family can do proactively to avoid a lot of conflict. And the essential conversations obviously helps avoid the conflict. Okay, so now let's talk about it from the different standpoint, which is in the aftermath, what might need to happen. So what's the role, and this is a little bit of a shout out here to professionals who are on the call as well, because professionals, you can help encourage families to have these conversations. I always say we're talking about a dual process of make sure documents are in place and make sure conversations happen. And professionals are often the ones that encourage that. They're also the ones in the aftermath of the death of a spouse who can help the surviving spouse in significant ways. So this is to both professionals and family members. So this may seem obvious: respect the life experience of the surviving spouse. Sometimes what happens is that the adult children often feel that they have to swoop in, that their parent can't manage this. And what I always say is make sure there's a discovery process. Don't just assume your parent can't do this. You want to figure out where are the gaps in knowledge, what needs to happen, what kind of support do they need. Don't assume, do some discovery, pull in professionals as needed to figure out where gaps are. And then there's an empowerment that family and professionals can do for surviving spouse. And this empowerment looks like an emotional empowerment and providing resources. So, what we know is when people are grieving, that there is often a real drop in confidence. Grief is exhausting. It saps us of our confidence. It saps us of our energy. And so the people around a surviving spouse really need to be there as an emotional support network to say, you can do this. There's reassurance in this. We can help you get the guidance and support you need. You are competent. So all that empowering is hugely important. And it's important from the role of the professional as well as the family. And then, of course, there's a need to provide resources. And what those resources are depends on the situation. It could be legal resources. It could be banking resources. It could be financial advisory resources, whatever that might be. Make sure that you're supporting the surviving spouse with the practical and the emotional. And then there's another key part of this that I think often gets lost, and it a little bit goes along with the life experience part. It's about empathy. And, one of the things I teach professionals and I teach families is empathy always wins. Often people hesitate to be empathic because they're concerned that if they're empathic, that what they're doing is facilitating dependence instead of independence. And those two things are separate issues. So the goal is to be empathic while facilitating the independence of the surviving spouse. And when we talk about empathy, I think very few of us have been taught to do this well. I will tell you that my preference on empathy is short. It is saying, I see you, I hear you, I recognize what you're going through. We often get into fixing things. And as professionals, of course, our role is to provide advice and to fix, but we are so much better if we start with the empathic and convey to the client that we really understand their experience and what they're going through. Our professional advice lands much better in that way. And in families, I think empathy is such a trick because, again, we haven't been taught to do it very well. And we think, well, maybe we need to somehow, push this person forward. So what I would say is make sure you do a good job with empathy. I'm so sorry you're going through this. I can't imagine what you're going through right now. It's one of my favorite ones is I can't imagine what you're going through, which is true. We never know what someone's going through. So I would actually say to you, if you take 2 points away from my time chatting with you, have essential conversations and be empathic will be the best things that you can do. And empathy, again, always wins. There's a wonderful little video I want to tell you about that in case you want to watch a really great 3-minute video on empathy. Brene Brown, B-R-E-N-E Brown, has an animated 3-minute video where she does a fabulous job talking about empathy. So this idea of facilitating independence is key. Now, not everybody wants to be independent. You're going to have surviving spouses who really want somebody to come in and take care of everything. And if that's the case and you're the family, there can be real resentments that build up here. So everybody needs to be clear about their boundaries. This, again, is the essential conversations part. If you're the adult kids and you're saying, hey, I don't want to take on running your life, then there's going to need to be conversations and professionals put into place to manage the things that the surviving spouse does not want to do. And then one of the best things that we can do, and we know this more and more now, is we really can encourage people to reach out to their support networks and to build their support network. And this goes hand in hand with facilitating independence. Oftentimes when spouses have been together for decades, There is a natural interdependence that occurs, obviously, and oftentimes the greater support network has fallen away. This is an opportunity to really rebuild a support network. And I could talk to you for long periods of time about that. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time on that, but I just want to say, make sure that you're encouraging your family member, the surviving spouse, to continue to develop supports. So in the aftermath, as professionals and families, we can do a lot to make this a better situation. So again, we're talking about proactively the conversations, and afterward the conversation, and working within the realistic confines of your family. Every issue that Elena talked about has an emotional and a family implication, and we cannot ignore those in the face of doing legal documents and dealing with the practical. So side by side, as you're looking at the practical, always be thinking about the emotional and the family, and go back to that. What do we need to think about? What do we need to talk about? And what do we need to take action on? And those 3 T's will get you through avoiding dealing with the emotional and family. You know, in my experience, the things that break families up are rarely what we think. It's rarely that legal issue. It's rarely the inheritance that didn't get handled well. What breaks families up are those emotional and family issues that never got dealt with. And those issues reverberate generations. So we have an opportunity in our own families, and we have an opportunity as professionals to change that. And this, I believe, is the way to do that. Okay, Eric, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you, Amy. And as you know, this is not the first time I've heard you speak on these issues. And what I always appreciate most about your comments is, you know, we hear all the time, especially those of us who work in the estate planning field, that that you have to have these conversations, and that you can avoid all these problems with succession planning if you just have these conversations, but nobody ever tells us how to do that. And so I really do appreciate the very practical advice that you give in that respect. So that was excellent. Thank you both very much. There are a number of questions on the line. Why don't I actually, Amy, because we're just on these topics, why don't I start with a question that was put to you? One audience member asks, how would you plan for the impact of the disruptor? How can you prepare the family for a family member who you know is going to be a disruptor?
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer in the generic, but I'll give you some ideas. So, for example, the family that I worked with, when we knew the daughter was going to be a disruptor, we actually dealt with it head on. So what we did is we pulled her in. Often disruptors are kind of on the outskirts a little bit. So and this shows up. I do a lot of work with caregiving families too. You know, these are the people who swoop in and there's a great plan going on, and then they come in and we're moving right towards Thanksgiving and you know, and to all of our holiday seasons and certainly just hit Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And so, you know, families get together and those people come home on non-COVID times, and they often throw every plan out the window. So what I try to do is bring the disruptor into the conversation. Let's bring that person in and let's try to deal with it head on. Now, it doesn't mean they're not going to still try to disrupt. It's harder to do if they haven't been able to stay on the outskirts. So that's why it's important to acknowledge them and not see them as this kind of force out there that, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to have conversations, and we're going to try to come up with then a process that will work, that the disruptor can't ultimately disrupt in the long run.
Okay. Thanks, Amy, for that. There's another question which is directed to Elena. Let me ask you. This first question is, and I'll just read the question because it's a bit longer. In a situation where shares of a private corporation are bequeathed to a spousal trust, what are your thoughts on leaving the shares within a GRE for 36 months prior to the transfer to the spousal trust in order to take advantage of the graduated rates on dividends paid out of the corporation during the GRE period?
That is a great question, and we've had to address that issue in the past. One of the questions is, having regard to the tax issues is obviously an important consideration. But another important consideration is there a clause in the will that talks about where the dividends are to go if they're paid out of the graduated rate estate before the spousal trust is set up? And if in fact the graduated rate estate paragraph says that the dividends can be paid to anybody, does that have an impact on the spousal trust? Does it taint the spousal trust if the dividends are paid to someone other than the spouse? My recollection from the research we did a number of years ago is it doesn't, but I think, don't trust me on that, but do your own research. It's not a slam dunk. And, you know, before you engage in that kind of planning, you should just confirm whether it does have a negative impact on the spousal trust and the rollover of the shares into the spousal trust.
Amy, this next one is for you. The question is, I know my son doesn't think my wife is competent to handle the business if I die first. We haven't talked about it, but I think he will be hard for her to deal with. Do you have any suggestions for dealing with that situation?
So again, what I always do is practical emotional side by side. So I would pull him in to the conversation, and I would have a very, I would have a discovery conversation about where does he see the gaps? What are his concerns? And perhaps there are really some legitimate concerns and maybe not, but make sure that those get addressed now. This is one of those, Eric, where I would be concerned about trying to avoid is going to increase the problem, right? If this spouse dies and his wife's going to have to deal with this. So this could absolutely be, this is we hear your concerns. My approach with the son would be, I'm so appreciative that you're concerned about your mom and the business. And so let's talk about this together and figure out where the gaps are and what we need to, if your mom actually has them, and with her in the room, obviously part of this, what do we need to do, and have a plan in place that will make it harder for him to disrupt later. This is a disruptor. I get to talk about all the disruptors, Eric, don't I? But
hey, I'm a litigator. I understand that.
Yeah. And there's the emotional piece, right? And being able to address it. And I think this is the opportunity too, to be able to be the I trust your mom. I'm here behind your mom, and I want you to hear that. So that has a lot of power to adult kids too, to hear it in your voice. So I think, again, I'm all about don't delay the conversations, but think side by side. What's the emotional implications, and what are the practical that need to be addressed to keep him from being a problem later on?
The next question I'm going to ask, let's go to Elena for this one. When placing a principal residence in a trust for a surviving spouse, how do you deal with and explain to the client the inability to include conditions such as remarriage?
So Amy and I are going to sound like we rehearsed this, but we didn't.
So
and having taken the family enterprise course, I know all about process and framing the issue. And I agree 100%. If this is going to be an issue, I think you have to be very frank with the client. I don't know how else you can avoid the problem, because if the intention is to say, if my wife or my husband remarries, then out of the house, which very often is an emotion, then you have no choice but to explain, well, you lose the principal residence exemption afterwards, and they may be prepared to suffer the tax consequences of that result if they really care about the remarriage situation. So again, it is the conversation you have to have. And if they are not prepared to, if they're saying, look, I want the principal residence exemption, and I want to provide for a remarriage situation, there's an impossibility there. So again, frankness and early conversations is very important. And if it doesn't work out, then maybe you have to think about an alternative, or providing some funds to provide for the spouse separately than in a spousal trust of that type. So again, there are some intractable situations, but having that conversation early is very important.
You should know I'm going to take credit, by the way, for putting the two of you together and for recognizing that these issues dovetail so nicely together. We have about time for probably one more question for each of you. Amy, let me ask you. Here's a question. When I try to talk to my husband about what will happen with the business if he dies first, he gets uncomfortable and changes the conversation. What do you do in these circumstances?
So part of what we're always trying to do is figure out how to get people to engage in the conversation. So you can say everybody needs to talk, but you can't always get everybody involved. So one of the frames, there are a couple ways that I often think you can get people involved. One of them is through this idea of legacy that I mentioned. So the idea of saying to somebody, thinking about what their legacy will be if they don't have this conversation, what could potentially happen, right? And when people think about that, I mean, most of us want to leave behind, I'd say all of us want to leave behind peace, order, harmony, control. We don't want to leave behind chaos. And so when people start to think about, well, that could be my legacy, that may be a motivator to engage somebody. The other motivator often is taking care of their spouse, right? That I don't want to leave you in a mess. So when they recognize, again, the impact of what not doing this will mean, that's often how we can pull people into conversation. Mm-hmm. People will often do things for other people that they won't do for themselves. And that's the way they'll talk about things, they'll go through discomfort because it benefits somebody I love, even though I don't really want to do it. So that's often the way I get people to come aboard.
I'm sure there are people who are more and less receptive to that kind of conversation. One last question, Elena, for you. This one will resonate since it's a factor for me as well. All our 3 children and their spouses or kids have become US citizens. What should the structure of our advisors be? Does our Canadian advisor choose or hire a US advisor, or do I?
The reason Eric says this resonates is because Eric had the misfortune or fortune of being born in Florida when his dad and I were changing careers. So Eric is American and he gets to vote in the upcoming elections. So vote carefully. Every time I talk to a client who has US factors in his or her planning bag, either because they or their children are US citizens or living in the States, or they have assets in the States. It happens all the time lately. This is an issue that resonates, and it's one of the first questions that I ask is, do you have a US element in your planning? So the question that arises is, how do we deal with that? If the client comes to me, then I say, look, the US issues are more complex than our issues here in Canada. So the starting point is, what is the impact of the United States income tax and estate tax and the treaty on the planning? And absolutely, we need US advisors. I know enough to be very dangerous. I know what has to be done, but I'm not trained or qualified to provide US tax advice. I really rely on US advisors. I have, if the client is with an accounting or a law firm that has US expertise, then clearly the first starting point would be with those people. But if they don't, then I have a series of referrals that we can consider and consult. I can also tell when someone doesn't know what they're talking about. So not everyone knows everything, and it's always best to have someone who appreciates and understands the Canadian tax scenario and also really steeped in the US tax issues. So hope that helped answer the question.
Thank you both very much for your time this morning. That was obviously very informative and very useful, I think, to everyone on the line. So I thank you both. You can mute yourselves and stop your videos, and we will move on to our next speaker, who is Sarah Lefton. Sarah began her career as a corporate lawyer in a leading large firm in Toronto. Today, she is Vice President Philanthropy and Campaign Director at UJA Federation. And she is an inspiring speaker who is going to give us a snapshot of the work that UJA does in our community and the importance of engaging the next generation in philanthropy. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us.
Thanks so much, Eric, and thank you to everybody on the phone for taking some time to join us today. I've been listening in, and it's certainly a flashback to my old life prior to working at UJA when I was downtown. But it's just incredibly important conversation, and I'm thrilled that we're able to have it this morning. So I think for many of you on the phone, you're actually quite familiar with UJA, maybe even to varying degrees, and to our role in the community. But I really wanted to spend a few moments talking about how our work has evolved during this pandemic, and how we've been addressing some of the challenges that have come up that we may or may never have seen actually before. And in particular, how we've been engaging younger generations in the community in community philanthropy. And even how in COVID we've seen these efforts increase. So for many of you, you've seen that the collective and comprehensive approach that we take is one that makes our community very special. I actually think that we hear very frequently from other communities who are looking to the Jewish community for some guidance on how to organize or how to address key challenges in sort of a collective way. I think we see many organizations pop up sort of across other groups in the community and society that are trying to address specific concerns, but very rarely do you see the level of organization and sophistication that we have in the Jewish world. And it's not just in Toronto, but actually, in the larger Jewish world, if you go to any large Jewish community, you see through the federation system, organizations that have pulled together really sort of, the best and brightest in different organizations to actually harness the power of community to address these big concerns. Right now in COVID, there's almost no better time than to see this, right? So if UJA's role is really to look at the overall health of the community, how is the community functioning? Not just a component of community, but the whole thing. How healthy are we? Are we thriving as a community, right? And that could involve, what does Jewish identity look like? What does support for Israel look like? How are we taking care of our most vulnerable? How are we combating anti-Semitism? What is the level of knowledge that we are giving our younger generations on about Judaism and about their role in Jewish community through Jewish education? All of these factors go into making a Jewish community thrive. And that's really our role. UJ's role is to look at the big picture and to see at any one moment is one falling behind. And, in COVID, we were able to see instantly that we had a significant challenge on our hands. It wasn't hard to see. We saw it in the broad community as well, not just the Jewish community, but that our numbers were of people who were vulnerable and in need of support were actually doubling. No better place, as I said, to address this issue in an integrated way. We harnessed the power of all our social service agencies and came together both through Annual Campaign and the Jewish Foundation to create an integrated strategy and fundraising strategy in particular to address these issues. I'll give you a couple of examples of how this has played out in this pandemic. With the Annual Campaign, which I think many of you know is a big community fund, unrestricted fund that people contribute to across the community, and every year those funds are granted out to more than 100 agencies who are able to deal with particular parts of our community. So it could be social service agencies, it could be things like Birthright and March the Living, it could be Hillel on campus, it could be our advocacy agency, CEJA, you name it. But each of these component parts is supported by the UJ's Annual Campaign. And the nature of an unrestricted fund, community fund, that we can frankly pivot, which is, I know, the word of the day in this pandemic, but where we can pivot funds instantly has never been more important than it was at the beginning of this pandemic. We were able to pause programs that we generally fund and that we generally grant money to, that we couldn't or that weren't necessarily relevant during the pandemic. And we were able to immediately target funds towards urgent needs. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We had survivors and isolated seniors who were living and usually had assistance of some organizations or caregivers who couldn't come in once COVID hit, and were now more isolated and didn't have access to food or to medical care that they usually had. We were able to direct funds there. To PPE for our frontline workers in the community, people who were going in, caseworkers, who are dealing with, difficult family situations, people who are working with RENA, Kayla Center, things like that. We were able to actually put out an emergency grant within the first week of COVID hitting to Jewish Free Loan, because as many of you know, Jewish Free Loan has access to funds to give out to individual community members who are struggling, but they actually had no way, no infrastructure online at the beginning of the pandemic to distribute those funds. And so we were able to take funds from the annual campaign, because they're unrestricted, and put them where they were needed most in that moment. And that was to build online infrastructure to give out these community loans, which have now helped just a tremendous number of people who have lost jobs, and are in very, very difficult financial circumstances. So that's through annual campaign. We've also been able to provide immediate food relief. We've had, I'm going to say, over 300 donors who have previously been donors to the annual campaign who called and actually had found themselves for the first time ever, not in a position to donate, but actually looking for food support. People who, had lost jobs, previously had been making, call it $60,000 to $80,000 a year for their family income, even $100,000, lost their job, had no way to buy groceries. And we were able to get them on a program, a food delivery program from UJ annual campaign, where we could deliver them food every couple of weeks. Similarly, through the Jewish Foundation, many of you know that we were able to connect with fund holders to look at providing emergency assistance in our community. And, one clear area is, I'll go to an agency which many of you know called JAX. We've seen an 85% increase in demand for addiction and mental health counseling through JAX since the beginning of the pandemic. And we were able to go to a fund holder where this is a particular issue of interest for them. And we were able to grant out some emergency funds to that organization to help meet that challenge. This is just an example of what the magic, I'll say, of the collective is during a crisis. We are able to, as I said, pivot and direct funds where we need it most. I'll just say one more thing, and then I'll quickly go for the last couple of minutes to the next gen. The magic of the collective is something that I like to use the CJA example. So many of you know we have the advocacy arm of the federation system is CJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. And they are essentially our in-house government relations and crisis communications experts. They're also funded out of the UJ annual campaign. And in a crisis, they're able to go to government and try to make sure that we get access to as many government dollars as possible. And we can leverage the money that comes in either through the Jewish Foundation or through the annual campaign with government dollars to make sure that we can make an even bigger impact. So that is actually quite different than when a gift is given to an individual agency. When a gift is made to UJ, in this case, and to the campaign, we're able to get matching dollars, in many cases through government. Actually, right now, we have a special opportunity because 7 leading foundations in the States, in America, have just announced that they're going to match us 2-to-1 through Jewish Federations of North America for every new dollar raised in the campaign. But again, it comes through the collective, it multiplies, and then we can give it out to the agencies as more support. I'll say that during these times, during the pandemic, we have never seen so many young people step up. And at the beginning, we were asking why. One of our greatest challenges is really engaging younger generations in philanthropy. And part of it is they just haven't been exposed to the value of philanthropy. And we see a direct connection, and I think this is obvious, but from the young people who have had either a mentor in their professional life or family members who have passed on that value of philanthropy, we see it's much easier to have them engaged and to inspire them to give back and support their community early on. And it goes without saying that the more they know, the more of a planned approach they can take by opening a donor advised fund or really being planned in their philanthropic giving instead of just sort of making ad hoc gifts in their early years. I'll say we've really made it a focus at UJA of teaching the value of philanthropy, and we've actually set up a platform called UJA Genesis that works with these younger generations to pass these values on. I'll say we've recognized 2 things. Number one is exposure to value of philanthropy and making sure that we're literally just talking about it with the younger generations. And I would say in your businesses and in your families, don't hold back. We speak to parents sometimes, parents who have adult children who, or adult children, parents who have children who are now adults, where they don't talk about giving money away and they don't talk about their philanthropic plans. And they think that, they say, one day we'll talk about it. One day we'll have the conversation, but now's not the time. The issue is that developing a value of giving back is something that takes years and years to establish. And so the earlier you can even introduce, young people to this concept of giving back and supporting community is really important. One of the things I often say to my peers and to young people in our community is community doesn't happen by accident. I think so many young people assume that, if they want to go on a birthright trip, they can go. And if they're on campus and they're dealing with anti-Israel sentiment, someone will help them fight it through Hillel or CJA. And if, they want PJ Library books, they can get them in their homes, no matter what it is. The community is there, March of the Living, so on and so forth. But the community is not there. We have to actually create the community. And that's really, I think, the message that we should take away today. Teaching the value of philanthropy, whether or not it's to people who work with you or people in your family, but planning that for those philanthropic values is exceptionally important. And transferring that message and passing that message along that the community doesn't happen by accident. We are exceptionally lucky to live in one of the best communities in the world, one of the best Jewish communities in the world. But it's deliberate. It takes planning, it takes organization, and it takes philanthropic commitment. So thank you for being here today. You can always reach out to me again. My name is Sarah Lefton, and I'm always happy to chat. And thank you, Eric. Back over to you.
As always, that is very helpful, and that is exactly the message that we do want to send. And it's a message that it's not just one that the UJA wants to get out there, but it's one that we hear from our clients when we work with clients doing estate planning, that they also want to know how to engage the next generation and recognize that the community doesn't build itself, that we have to make that happen and pass that fabric of philanthropy down generation to generation. So thank you, Sarah, for that. Our next speaker is Saul Plenner. Saul was the national leader for PricewaterhouseCoopers private company services practice in Canada for the past 7 years. He also serves as the firm's national managing partner for strategy and operations. His practice focuses on business issues affecting owners and leaders of private companies, including business succession planning, and that's why we've asked him to come speak to us today. I'm very pleased that he's agreed to speak to us about the financial benefits of philanthropic gifts and how to structure those gifts. So Saul, I leave that to you.
Thank you, Eric. Good morning, everybody. Shana Tova. The meaning of healthy and happy new year has never meant more than it does today, that's for sure. Over the next 15 minutes or so, I just want to talk about an introduction to how you can structure a gift, as well as hopefully having some time for some questions, but let's move right into this. So this is meant to be a primer, introduce you to some gift-giving structuring alternatives. Now, what I will say about this one is every situation is different. There is structuring opportunities to each of those situations, and they are very specific. There's not necessarily a general rule that you can follow. So that's the first objective that I'd like to accomplish in the next 15 minutes or so. And then the second one, which is a theme that you've been hearing so far in this discussion, is start thinking about your legacy and your philanthropic goals. How do you want it to move, not just over the next 5 years, the next 10 years, but to create a more permanent legacy for yourselves and for your family? So specifically, I'm going to address what the after-tax cost of a donation is and some structuring alternatives there to bring down that cost. The benefits of a donor-advised fund, so a little bit of an ad for the Jewish Foundation, who is tremendous at this and really offer differentiated products and services. And then finally, how you can create your own family legacy moving forward. Before I get into that, I just wanted to give you all a personal reflection of mine. I started out on this journey a little bit late. Some would suggest that it's never too late to give, but my family, we believe that philanthropy is an evolutionary process. So for me and my wife, the process is about ensuring that our kids understand the importance of helping others, be it financially or otherwise, like giving their time. So to us, our legacy will be ensuring that our kids, and hopefully their kids, continue to build on that foundation that we've established today. It's not a big amount, it's starting and moving it forward. It's also about communicating. You've heard that term, and that's going to come up again. How you communicate with your family, let them know what is important to you and the true meaning of tzedakah in a much bigger way than perhaps they've heard in the past. A couple very general points. Donations can take many forms. It's not just a cash donation. You can see the different examples up here on the slide. But this next point is something that we all have to think about. The after-tax cost of giving can range anywhere between 5 and 50%. So that's a pretty huge difference. There are strategies that should be considered. I'm going to focus today on personal giving, personal donations. There's also the alternative of donating through a corporation, which will bring down your cost of giving significantly to something closer to that 5%. And I'll explain that very, very quickly. It's also important just to think about your short-term and your long-term funding objectives. And when do you want to put money into this? Is it a longer-term funding mechanism, or is it something that you want to set up today in a much more material or substantial way? And the other point that we should all be considering is many of us like to give, not just within Canada, but perhaps to Israel, to some US charities, whatever it is. And we should be thinking about the tax implications, not just in those jurisdictions, but in Canada as well, to make sure that we're maximizing the benefit to the organizations. So let's talk about what is the actual cost of a donation. And for me, my evolution was, first, I responded to a whole bunch of requests and asks of friends and family where they asked me to donate. And I started to move further to think about how I can maximize the impact of my gift. And the starting point for most of us is we donate based on the cost to give. What can I afford to give? And then how much should the charity get from there? So for the first example, and I've used $1 million just to give me a nice round number to do these calculations, $1 million cash donation would result in a donation tax credit in Ontario of over $500,000. And so my after-tax, your after-tax cost of the donation is about 50% of that. So at the end of the day, the charity gets $1 million, and the cost to you to give the charity the $1 million is $500,000, or a little bit lower than that. That's where most people start, and in fact, most people stop. There are other alternatives. And the focus for me has been on how I can maximize the donation I give, or the dollars that the charity would receive. So in example 2 here, what we're looking at is a donation of public company shares. And for ease of calculation, I've assumed that there's no cost base. So that's pure profit on public company shares, which doesn't happen that often, but let's focus on the gain there. So you have $1 million gain on the public company shares, and I've made the decision to give that to a charity. So the donation tax credit in Ontario is the same in this situation. So there's a $500,000 or $504,000 tax credit available that I would deduct. And then I would also save money on not having to pay tax on that capital gain. And to me, that would be, to us, that would be a $267,000 tax savings. So at the end of the day, by donating shares of a public company, the after-tax cost of that donation goes to something around 23%. So what that allows me to do is, if at the end of the day, if I use column 1, if my thought process was, I can afford and want to give a donation which will cost me at the end of the day $500,000. What example 2 says is, if you're lucky enough to have public company shares that have an embedded gain on them, I can get twice as much to the charity for my same cost. So I'm comparing columns 1 and column 2. So that looks pretty attractive. I benefit from it, the charity absolutely benefits from it, and there's more dollars to give to the community. The third example that I want to take you through is flow-through shares and donating flow-through shares. And there's a number of different organizations out there that provide this type of product. We see it a little bit more and more. We'll start with $1 million purchase of flow-through shares. What that gets you is, first, you get a deduction for tax purposes, generally would be around $535,000. Each of the products that you'll see out there for flow-through shares will be calculated a little bit differently. So this is just for illustrative purposes. And what I've done is taken generally the ratios that you see on these types of products. So there's a $535,000 tax savings on the deduction that I get from the flow-through shares. It also generates an investment tax credit that will be applied against my taxes otherwise payable, and that would save me $80,000. And once again, the donation tax credit is still available, and that would be another $504,000 of savings. Now, on this transaction, there's actually a capital gain that would be incurred by you or generated by you that you would have to pay tax on. And the tax cost of that is somewhere around $267,000. So when you look at the $1 million and you do your plus and minuses as you go through this, the tax cost of donation through flow-through shares is somewhere around 15%. Now, I've seen products out there that the tax cost is as low as 9 or 8%, and I've seen them where they're as high as 20%. The point I want to make to all of you today is you can significantly increase what you give to charities by using these different structures, these different alternative ways to give to the charity. And so the real point here is this should be done carefully, it should be done thoughtfully, and it should be done in a way that's going to maximize your ability to give to the charities that mean the most to you. So I want to move just into the benefit of a donor advised fund, and the specific example here is with the Jewish Foundation, of course, and I've done a lot of work with the Jewish Foundation, and Janice Benatar has helped me come up with these points, and I just want to go through them quickly with you. First of all, the donor advised fund here is very easy to establish with a very low cost. And so when it was first explained to me that a fund could be created, a foundation fund could be created with a minimum investment of $10,000, it started to perk my interest here because it was something that I could try, I could see where it evolved to. And as I'm going to speak about in a moment, I was able to talk to my family about it as well and get them involved. The fee for this is, we're going to start with 1%. But that fee goes down depending on the asset value that you have in the foundation. So it's a very, very low cost to administer. The fund is stable with $650 million of current and future pledged assets. And the growth on those funds have been excellent, 6% over 20 years. Last year was a little bit weaker. It was 2.8%, but since July and August, the fund has generated over 4% of a return so far. So, a little bit of a hit given COVID, but we're seeing a recovery now. And so, very stable fund that will work for you. There's privacy on this. It is very private. It's up to you on how you want to share it, but everything you do within the foundation is between you and the foundation and nobody else. The foundation also allows you to provide for succession, which I think is incredibly important. It gives you the ability to include your family and that next generation, as we just heard from Sarah, in your philanthropic goals and objectives. And it also gives you a very wide range of planned giving options. So on this one here, what I like and what's very attractive is you can draw up a philanthropy plan, share that with your family. And we go back to the communication point that was raised earlier. If everybody understands what your objectives are, what you would like to see done moving forward, then you're going to have a better chance for that buy-in with your family. And more importantly, you start to involve them in those decisions. And obviously, there's a lot of flexibility with this fund, and you really don't have any limitations on where you're going to give, how you want to give, nor the amounts that you want to give. So this next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about family legacy. To me, that was incredibly important. It wasn't just what I was doing, it was how I was going to involve my 3 kids who are 30, 28, and 25. So you start with some of those family participation benefits where you're defining your family's purpose and values. You're protecting your legacy. You can also pool funds by creating a foundation. You can pool your funds together so there are more significant contributions. So as my kids decide that they want to start giving and have the financial resources to do so, they can put their money into the foundation, which gives us greater earning potential on that foundation, as well as better choices or more financial resources available to make the donations. This next point, we heard a little bit previously about it. It's just educating the younger generation, investing the time and making sure that they understand the importance of this. But I do want to emphasize this isn't always about financial contributions. Getting that next generation involved, understanding how they can invest their time, how they can give their time is incredibly important. And it's led to a number of very interesting family discussions at our dinner table that I didn't think we would otherwise be having. You can see some of the other points in there, and you can go over them. These slides will be available to you, but it really is on the family participation benefits, all about bringing the family together and making sure that you're moving forward on your legacy as you would like. There are other benefits here as well, and it does move you into much broader discussions. So what I have done with my clients is having a discussion around philanthropy, the objectives, and where we want to give is generally a pretty easy discussion. Where everybody wants to donate or give is changing. Our kids, my kids, have a much different view as to what's important to them and where they want to be giving. And my wife and my view is a little bit different. But by having these discussions, we can talk that through. We can come up with goals on if we're going to use our foundation dollars to give to specific charities, what are you also giving to that charity? If it's that important to you, what are you doing to help that charity further their cause? And so there's a whole bunch of other benefits here. Most importantly, you're starting that communication process. If you haven't had it before, you're giving your family, that next generation, the chance to discuss and move it forward. And it does lead, as I say, to very rewarding discussions and teaching that generation on how we can move it all together. So Eric, those were the main points that I wanted to bring across with this. And, I would recap it with one sentence, and that is, philanthropy is so important these days, especially so when so many people are hurting. And so whatever we can do, how we can involve our family, how we can set our legacy up in a way that we really want to be remembered moving forward is incredibly important. And the Jewish Foundation will help us achieve that as well. Thank you all so much for your time. Eric, I think we've got a couple minutes for questions, and I'll stop sharing my screen.
Absolutely. It's I appreciate those comments. And yeah, I would like to take just a minute. We're tight on time, but there's a question which I think is important to put to you. And if you could, and I think it's a quick answer that you might be able to give. One of the attendees asks, don't the organizations that sell flow-through shares charge a fee that decrease the savings?
Yeah, yes, they do. Generally, that fee is fairly modest when you look at the overall scheme. Most of the money does end up going to the charity as desired. I believe each plan would be a little bit different, but and how or who pays that fee is going to be a little bit different. So, Eric, my feeling on this, because I have used flow-through shares myself, it's a pretty modest fee, and at the end of the day, the biggest impact is going to the charity.
And if you could, again, just another quick question, which I think you'll be able to answer very easily. And this refers to one of the charts that you had presented. The ITC, the credit is taxable in the following year. Has that tax implication been taken into account in your charts?
Yes, it has. But again, I'll reaffirm that this last column is really about the general principles. When you go to actually look at a flow-through share and an offering, these numbers are all going to change, but each of the different providers show you exactly what the cost is going to be. And generally, it's somewhere between 10 and 20% for most of what I've seen over the last a year or two anyways.
Well, that's all the time that we have. So thank you for those comments and thank you for your time this morning.
You're so welcome. Thank you, Eric.
Our next speakers are going to tell us about how to use insurance to protect your business and your family. Jessica Davis is a chartered accountant with the accounting firm Fruitman Cates, and Ellie Scheuchert is a partner at Algie Brown and Associates. Jess and Ellie often work together helping clients with financial planning and insurance solutions, and that's why they're going to speak to us together today. Those of you who joined the webinar last week will recognize Ellie from the family business case study, during which he talked about his own experience integrating into a family-owned and operated business. So Jess and Ellie, welcome, and I will leave it to you. Jess, you're still muted.
I'm gonna try this. Is it better or worse?
Worse. We're getting a little feedback. Oh, there we go. That's better.
Okay, let's hope this works. Okay, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yep, that's better. Oh, Jessica, I think we've just lost your sound again. Jessica, we can't hear you again.
Of all their assets at fair market value. And as she described previously, your assets include your principal residence, vacation properties, investments, and the most commonly missed asset is usually shares of the family-owned business. So when there's two spouses and both are alive, there's an automatic transfer of capital property to the surviving spouse on a tax-deferred basis, meaning there's no taxes paid on the first person to pass away, which usually helps for cash flow purposes. On the second to die, however, that's where usually there's a large tax bill that some families have to plan for. One of the ways for planning for this is to purchase life insurance. Some Sorry, my slides are frozen. Okay. When a person passes away and they have common shares, the fair market value of the common shares are what we determine is the fair market value at someone's death. If the person has already frozen their shares, we're using their redemption value of their preferred shares on their death. One of the major issues that have come up in the last couple of years when people freeze is the issue of having a family trust own the common shares for the future generation. In July 2017, the Liberal government brought in something called TOSI, tax on split income. So there should be some consultation with your tax advisors when it comes to estate planning, as well as post-mortem tax planning, as TOSI has serious concerns going forward. My next example is going to go through a case study about the different assets inside a corporation and the resulting tax implications of not having post-mortem tax planning and what you can do to avoid it. Okay, so the case study first decides was Mrs. A owning shares of a holding company that have an asset value of $7.2 million with no costs and no paid up capital. The underlying assets inside the corporation for purposes of ease also have a $7.2 million value. The cost base is $3.5 million, and there's corporate tax attributes of refundable dividend tax of $280,000 and a capital dividend account, which is $325,000. Currently, the corporation also has a life insurance death benefit of $5 million on the deceased. These are the tax rates in Ontario at this point in time. I would hesitate to say that these are likely going to go up. So this presentation is based on the 2020 balances. Okay, so upon death, there's a deemed disposition for the individual of 6.8 million. I'll come to how I got to 6.8 million in a second. Half the gain in Canada is taxable at 50%. So the tax liability on the individual death would be $1.8 million. If you decided that you were going to wind up the corporation as there's no, the family has decided there's no longer a benefit of having the corporation, in order to wind up the corporation, there would be corporate taxes inside the corporation of $365,000. The combined tax rate of the individual dying as well as the corporation winding up and selling all the assets and removing all the cash is a combined effective tax rate of 62%. So when we talk about as tax advisors estate planning, we're basically trying to reduce the 62% down to more of a reasonable number. And the three strategies before is how we get to those, how we reduce it. So the first situation is using 164 loss carryback. By way of ineligible dividend and a capital dividend. So when you take out capital dividend is tax-free to Canadian citizens only and Canadian residents. If you are a US citizen or a US green card holder, the capital dividend is actually taxable to you. So the tax on the ineligible dividend to wind up a corporation would be approximately $2.2 million. When you redeem the value shares from a corporation, essentially you're taking the proceeds which you previously taxed less the deemed dividend to get to a zero value. That means your shares have no longer value and you carry back a capital loss. By carrying back the capital loss, the effective tax rate ends up being 32%, which is less than the 62. So some people like to go down this road. The only complication with using this route is if you want to continue operating the corporation and they're not frozen value shares, you don't, normally we have to butterfly or some other transaction in order to do this, but if you decide you no longer wanted the corporation, the most effective tax rate of winding up a corporation is through the 164.6. Another option is what we call a pipeline transaction. It's the same deed disposition of above for the taxpayer. So there's a $7.2 million, the tax rate of 53% gets to an income tax payable of $1.9 million. The net tax in a pipeline transaction would be 26 cents because you're only paying tax on the fair market value of the shares or the redemption value at death. Cost. So through a bunch of transactions, you're able to essentially strip out the value of the shares at 26.76%, which is essentially half the capital gains rate. By owning corporate life insurance, there's a couple advantages. One of the advantages, the premiums, however, it's paid by the corporation, are not deductible for tax purposes. However, the premiums that are inside the corporation are using corporate tax dollars versus personal tax dollars to pay them. So some people like those, having the corporation own the policy for that reason. It's also an effective way to fund the tax liability on the redemption value of the shares. When the life insurance premiums come into the corporation, they get added to something called the capital dividend account, which allows the corporation to redeem shares and or pay out a tax-free dividend to the beneficiaries of the shareholders of the corporation.
Jess, I think we need to pivot to Ellie now. Just
sorry about that.
Thank you.
No problem.
Good morning. I'm just going to share my screen. At Algie Brown and Associates, we like to speak about the power of purpose. As Charles Parkhurst said, purpose is what gives life meaning. It therefore makes sense for us to speak about life insurance within the context of purpose. In our firm, what we do is help individuals and their families use their wealth to fulfill the purposes they value most. So let's talk about the purpose of life insurance. In our early years, when we buy life insurance, it is often for the purpose of protecting human capital. Life insurance replaces a needed stream of income lost in the event of premature death. But what about later on in life when we no longer need to protect our income, either because we don't have dependents or because we have accumulated sufficient capital? Is there still a need for life insurance? At this point, the purpose of life insurance changes from replacing the required income stream to protecting the value of one's net worth from taxes and market risk. We want to protect our financial capital, fund tax liabilities, tax effectively transfer assets from the corporation, as well as use life insurance as an alternative asset class for safe money. All of this can be achieved with permanent life insurance. And you may ask, how can we do this with a simple life insurance policy? This morning, I will show you in the time that we have left how the purpose of life insurance can change to accomplish these goals and more, creating immediate liquidity on death, reducing investment taxes, and safely transferring assets to the next generation tax efficiently. In 2019, Capgemini did a fascinating study of high net worth individuals in which they concluded that on average, high net worth families kept about 26% of their assets in cash or near cash equivalents. The reason for this is because at a certain point, wealth preservation becomes a key. They don't necessarily want to make more money by taking more risks. They want to preserve the capital that they have accumulated and reduce risk. This does not only apply to high net worth individuals, it also applies to many of us who have accumulated some wealth during our working years. Our investment clients in our firm often tell us that when they have accumulated their nest egg, they tell us, I don't want you to make me rich. I want you to make sure that my family never becomes poor. What goes hand in hand with this study is that high net worth families are buying more life insurance than ever before. We did a study with Sun Life of Canada, and of the top 10 life insurance contracts that were bought in 2019, they ranged from a 52-year-old who bought $160 million of life insurance, paying a premium of $12.5 million a year, to a 48-year-old couple who bought a $40 million policy for $1.3 million a year. Now, you may be wondering how people spend that much money on life insurance, and I certainly don't know the particulars of these cases. But in our practice, when people are looking to spend significant amounts of money like this on insurance, we sometimes show them a strategy whereby after paying the premium, we use the insurance as collateral and borrow the premium paid into the policy back so that the funds can then be deployed into other investable assets. This allows them to have their cake, to have the insurance, and eat it too, meaning they can still use the assets in other investments. The strategy is called the IFA, or immediate finance arrangement. It's not for everyone, but in the right situation, it works incredibly well. What we do see, though, is that life insurance is being bought in very large amounts, and there are some good reasons for that. The individuals buying these policies are looking at funding tax liabilities and tax effectively transferring corporate assets to the next generation and protecting their capital. So how does the life insurance work so that we can accomplish these goals? There are three main features of life insurance that we focus on: guarantees, tax advantages, which include the capital dividend account, as well as the underlying conservative asset management. The guarantees are extremely important in an era of huge stock market volatility. Insurance policy offer guarantees that cannot be found elsewhere. We really don't have to look much further than yesterday's action on the stock market. The amount of coverage purchased in a life insurance policy is guaranteed and cannot go down. Premiums are payable either for life or for a specified period of time, which can be guaranteed. The investments within the underlying portfolio are extremely conservative, and those drive the dividends that are paid into the policy, irrelevant of market volatility. Once dividends have been declared, they are vested and will never go down. The conservative nature of the participating fund is one of the advantages of whole life insurance. The fund has a significant fixed income portion with some equities and real estate, and the standard deviation, which is the measure of volatility, is significantly less than the stock market. One of the other advantages are the tax rules of the policy. All the money that goes into an insurance policy grows tax-free in the policy, and when the policy is paid out, the death benefit is also tax-free. When we compare this with a corporate investments, in the corporation, when you invest money in fixed income, 50.17% of the fixed income is taxed. Or, excuse me, the tax rate on the fixed income is 50.17%. With capital gains and dividends, it is slightly less. Within the insurance policy, though, the tax-free growth continues to grow all the way through to death on a tax-free basis. On death, when the policy is held corporately, the proceeds are paid tax-free into the corporation, and the proceeds then come out through the capital dividend account. The calculation of the capital dividend account is a death benefit minus the adjusted cost base of the policy. We'll just give you one short example as time is short. We used a situation with Sheila, a client of ours, who had $100,000 a year to invest. One of her options was to invest that $100,000 in a mortgage fund where she was going to receive 7% interest. Her goal was to invest the money for 10 years, after which she would continue to accumulate the funds for another 15 years. After 25 years, the corporate account value after tax had grown to $2.2 million. However, on death, in order to get those funds out to her family, taxes needed to be paid, and her family was left with $1.4 million. We looked at an alternate strategy, and that is using life insurance. So utilizing the same investment dollars and taking $100,000 a year for 10 years, she could buy a policy for $1,160,000. After 25 years, through the growth of the policy would grow to $2.5 million, and the $2.5 million would be paid tax-free into the corporation. Due to the use of the capital dividend account, $2.3 million came out of the corporation on a tax-free basis. The advantage of the insurance policy was $897,000. The equivalent that she would have to earn in the investment would be 11.2%. Certainly, there are many different situations, and we don't recommend putting all of your assets into life insurance. But when looking at your overall portfolio, one asset class that you may wish to consider as part of a diversified portfolio is life insurance.
Ellie, thank you very much for those comments and for explaining that. That was a very clear explanation of the benefits. And thank you to Jess as well. Let's move right away to Leonard Abramsky, the co-chair of this year's campaign, who's going to give us a few closing words.
Good morning, and thank you, and thank you to all the participants. I sat here and learned a lot, some of which I had absorbed already, but I just want to take this opportunity to introduce myself. As was mentioned, I'm the co-chair of this year's campaign. Sarah Lefton, who you met earlier, is my boss, although I'm a volunteer. I grew up actually in Kingston, Ontario, and actually that's where I'm calling you from today, sitting in one of our family offices. I grew up in Kingston, and my Jewish life circled around my synagogue and UJA, or it was UIA here in Kingston. And it was very, very important to my father and to my mother that UIA was a big part of their support for their philanthropy. Obviously, they gave to hospitals locally and things like that, but absolutely the first dollars and first checks for philanthropy were always written to UIA and to our synagogue. And it ingrained in me at an early age the importance of giving philanthropy and supporting ourselves, supporting our fellow Jews. And through that, now ultimately I became the co-chair of the campaign. And this has been a tremendously unusual year. I could have never imagined when accepting the role of the chair this year that I would do this without ever having to wear pants, as an example. Life has become a Zoom call. But everybody has zoomed in more than anybody ever could imagine. And the community has come through in flying colors. We set a goal of over and above from 60 million to 85 million this year. And I can tell you that we are well on our way to reaching that goal. It's been a challenging year, and I have found it deeply gratifying this year to take on this opportunity along with Sarah Zagdansky, my co-chair, and the wonderful team that we have at UJA and the massive amount of volunteers that step up every year. As Jews, our world is so much bigger. And the model that my father and mother have set for me is that we are not just Jews in a world, but our world is the Jewish people. And our businesses and our circle of friends all revolve around the Jewish community in my family and in our situation. And it's tremendously inspired. Yesterday, I sat and wrote thank you notes and signed thank you letters to our donors. And I can tell you literally thousands of donors, 7,000 donors have already shown up for our campaign. And it's through the generosity of this community that we live in Toronto that really inspires me to continue to do the work we do. As I mentioned to you at the beginning, I'm in Kingston today. My great-grandfather arrived here in 1890. And my grandfather and my great-grandfather started a business which my father took over, and now my brother and I have a bit of a real estate business here. So when we talk about succession planning, I really well understand the need and the importance to do this well, but not just through business, but also through philanthropy. And I think the tremendous work that the Jewish Foundation does in encouraging philanthropy on a long-term, lifetime, multi-generational basis is absolutely critical. I wish you all a good year of good health, happiness. We will get through this pandemic, and I really want to thank you so much for your time today. Thank you, Eric.
Leonard, thank you. Very nice, very kind of you. I want to thank everyone for having tuned in today to this webinar, and thank you to all of our speakers. I'd like to recognize the UJA staff who have helped make this event a reality despite these very challenging times we find ourselves in. Janice Benatar, who has worked on this program with me since day one. More recently, Brett Henry, Emily Krause, Marion Lupu, Sandra Sullivan-Keeley, and Mark Basman, who have each played such critical roles, many of whom are on the line with us today. I'd like to once again thank our signature sponsor, Scotiabank, and our webinar sponsor, wealthinsurance.com, for their ongoing support. Please take a moment to complete the survey, which you will receive by email shortly. It will help us make next year's event most useful to you. For those of you who are celebrating the Jewish high holidays, I wish you Gamar Hatima Tova, and to everyone on the line today, thank you and have a nice day.